here. In the beginning, bringing gender into Afro-American studies and bringing race into women's studies. Over the last 4 decades, there has been no more profound or challenging development in the academy than the emergence of Black studies and women's studies. Both interdisciplinary fields, as Dr. Roberts has so ably demonstrated, transforms our body of knowledge by bringing to bear new questions about research, methods of analysis, and theoretical frameworks. While we have gleefully, in many cases, challenged our institutions at large around these issues, the equally important effort to forge faculty and curricular relationships between the disciplines have been more fraught, more personal, particularly in the pre-intersection foundational years, when women of color were struggling to find and create their own center. During that period, in thinking about this, I thought about this foundational period. I was at Duke University with half of my appointment in women's studies and the other half in African American studies. And to say that the twain did not meet is an understatement. And I can tell you some stories, but I won't. But we and many others across the country looked toward the example of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst as a real and hopeful testing ground. There were great efforts and thinking and the bringing together of the best and most exciting minds in both fields. And as we will hear today on the panel, there were successes and there were failures in this project. But the boldness and the determination set an important standard and made important history. I'm happy to introduce to you today on this panel 2 bold and determined figures who were central to the making of that history, Arlene Avakian and John Bracey. I'm going to introduce them with some more details of introduction, and then they will give short opening statements of about 10 minutes apiece, and then we will open it up for conversation and Q&A. So please be prepared for Q&A, and I don't think I have to tell this group that, and conversation. Arlene is a professor emeritus and former chair of Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies here at the university, as Laura mentioned. A graduate student at UMass in 1973, she was appointed to the Women's Studies Subcommittee of the Faculty Senate Committee on the Status of Women, the body that wrote the proposal for a 2-year pilot program in women's studies. Before coming to UMass, she had been the executive director of what was then called the Female Studies at Cornell. I know that was an experience. Arlene worked with women's studies in various capacities, as a TA, as a staff member, as a lecturer, as a tenured faculty member, director, and department chair. Among the courses she developed was the social construction of whiteness and women, which she taught for many years beginning in 1996. And she is the author of Lion, L-I-O-N, Woman's Legacy, an Armenian American memoir. She's the editor of Through the Kitchen Window, Women Explore the Intimate Meaning of Food and Cooking, and the co-editor of From Betty Crocker to Feminist Food Studies, Critical Perspectives on Women and Food, co-editor of African American Women and the Vote, 1837 to 1965, as well as numerous articles. John Bracey is a professor in W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies and is serving a 2nd term as chair of the department. He has been at UMass, as was mentioned, since 1972. John has worked to help build a collaborative relationship between Afro-American studies and women's studies. He has been teaching a course on Black women in U.S. history since the 1970s, including, by the way, taught at Smith intermittent years, and co-developed and co-taught one of the first graduate courses on the history of African-American women. He was a participant in a 2-year-long 5-college faculty seminar, I believe both of them were, on Black Studies, Women's Studies, funded by a FIPSI grant. He also served as a planner and a participant in 2 conferences, the 60s Speak to the 80s, and African American Women in the Vote, as mentioned earlier. He was one of the co-principal investigators for the grants that funded the collecting, editing, and publishing of the papers of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He played a similar role in the publication of the correspondence of Lydia Maria Child. Professor Bracey's scholarly endeavors also include the co-editing of the papers of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the papers of Mary McLeod Bethune, and National Notes, the newsletter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And with this, we will begin with Arlene. Thank you.
I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to do this panel. It's been fun to think about it. This is I was one of the people who helped develop Women's Studies 187, which was a large intro course, which used to enroll 300 students every single semester. And when we got to the women's movement, I would say to my students, I am now a historical artifact. So today, John and I are historical artifacts. I also wanted to say that one of my other research interests is Armenian American women, which is something that kind of began with my memoir. So John and I are going to have a dialogue about our joint projects, but before we do that, I need to say a few things about why race and racism became a central concern of mine. I also want to say something about that process. And for those of you who didn't live through the 60s and 70s, I also want to try to convey the conviction we had at the time that the world had to be changed and that we were the ones to do it because our lives depended on it. Just as Dorothy said, yes, we are the ones to do it. I was profoundly moved by the civil rights movement and began my own slow and uneven process of seeing the centrality of race in the US and the world, as well as accepting my own racial privilege. The images on our televisions, almost daily it seemed, of people resisting the raw and violent power of white supremacy, fierce dogs, fire hoses that break bones, jailings, beatings, economic reprisals, and the threat of death, made clear to me that democracy in the US, heavily leavened as it was and still is by racism, was only for white people. Again, referring to what you were talking about, Black feminists raising these issues. I learned so much from listening to and reading the work of Black people, leaders of the movement, artists, novelists, poets, dramatists, and the few people I was lucky enough to count as friends. Their words and music began to make holes in my blinders, but I also resisted accepting what my head told me had to be true. The movement and all that I was learning about Black history, both racism and resistance to it, also touched a deep emotional core in me that helped me make connections to my family's history of genocide and displacement, as well as the possibility of resistance, even by those who had little institutional power. My mother's family were victims and survivors of the Armenian genocide, and my father's family were Armenians in Iran, who occasionally had to flee their villages because of cross-border raids by the Turks. Neither side of my family talked about any of this history, except for my grandmother, who once told me a short version about what she had experienced in the genocide when I was 14. She wanted me to tell the world, but I didn't even want to know about Armenians being killed merely for being Armenians, nor did I want to tell anybody about it. Even the Middle Eastern children in my neighborhood didn't know where Armenia was, and neither did I. And I had never heard about the Armenian genocide anywhere except that one time my grandmother told me the story. I wanted to get away, as far away from this knowledge as I could, because what I wanted more than anything was to assimilate into the 1950s version of America that was being represented all around me as white people who neither looked nor acted like my family. But I did know that I was not black. Although my family incorporated very little about American culture, they did adopt racism. Like other so-called white immigrants, they understood that it was important to be as white as possible. It was not until 10 years after my grandmother told me her story when I saw a theater performance that included a scene of a black child being sold away from his family that I began to think again of my grandmother's story about the Turks taking her son away and her successful struggle to get him back and the rest of the family out of exile. My connection to the black movement then, in addition to my recognition that it was a righteous struggle for justice, was very personal and emotional. My passion for racial justice and my coming to terms with my whiteness was neither merely rational, nor was it straightforward. Learning racism happens when we are very young, even before we have words, and it therefore becomes incorporated into our identities. Like sexism, it is naturalized, and when we are in the dominant position, we have to work hard to see what we are blind to, a difficult and lifelong project, particularly in a culture that consistently upholds whiteness. I've told you all of this because it is not typical for white people to prioritize anti-racism, and I needed to explain why race and racism became so important to me. There are exceptions, of course. White people like Anne Braden, whose 1958 autobiography, The Wall Between, chronicles what happened to her and her husband Carl when they agreed to Andrew Wade's request that they buy a house in a new development, this was in Louisville, Kentucky, and then sell it to him since the developer would not sell to a black family. Andrew Wade was reviled. He and his wife Charlotte were in physical danger and never able to live in the house Charlotte had wanted so much. The Bradens were charged with sedition against the state of Kentucky, and Carl Braden spent 18 months in jail. The book is a brilliant analysis of American racism and whiteness long before that term was coined. By chronicling her developing awareness of her racism and her journey to overcome it, Braden shows how white Americans, blind to the racism in this country, are unable to clearly see U.S. history or to understand themselves. This process is so obvious in the current absence of a racial analysis in most commentaries on the vicious attacks on and resistance to President Barack Obama, even among progressives who supported his election. His presidency has also been a gift to the right wing, which has effectively used racism to rally conservative forces against policies Republicans had supported in the past. My connection to the black movement awakened me and changed my life, and the women's movement saved my life. Growing up in a patriarchal Armenian family and in a sexist culture, I responded to the women's movement as if I were a drowning person being offered a lifeline. The movement helped me see the world and my world differently, and the effect was profound. And the early 1970s was a heady time. The civil rights movement had won some great victories, many of which unfortunately are now being eroded. And by 1973, the US pulled out of Vietnam, and those of us in the anti-war movement took credit for that. We were not only convinced we could change the world, but that our lives and the lives of our daughters depended on it. Yet, few in the women's movement or women's studies prioritized struggling against racism to achieve the new world. And what would this new world mean if it were only for white women? Again, I learned from women of color about the centrality of race to women's lives. But when I tried to bring this knowledge to the newly formed Women's Studies program, no one was really interested. Faculty might add a book about black women, usually Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, to the end of their syllabi, and often they did not get to it, but they included nothing else about race. Even if they did get to the book, the implicit message was, this course is about white women, and if we have time, we'll read a book about black women. So I was at odds with what had given me new life, but I was not willing to give up, to allow women's studies to proceed with an exclusive focus on white women. I felt as if I had the responsibility to do everything I could to bring race into women's studies. I realized pretty quickly that I did not have allies in women's studies, and I decided I would make connections with faculty in Afro-American studies. Janetta Cole and Esther Terry were co-teaching a course on black women, and I was really interested in hearing how they approached the subject as well as wanting to meet them. So I asked them if I could sit in on their course. I think they were perplexed, but they quickly agreed. That course was the first in a number I took, and though they were all undergraduate courses and I had an MA in American history, I learned so much, a measure of the extreme racial bias of the academy, even at a progressive school like UMass. In the early 1970s, there was not one course on slavery in the history department with a focus on American history. That situation did not change until fairly recently when they finally hired someone with expertise in the subject. The vitally important work of African American scholars was absent from other departments both at UMass and nationally, and I was more and more convinced that I had to prevent that from happening in women's studies. I also want to say that I found enormous generosity from faculty in Afro-Am and other black faculty in the 5 colleges who never refused my request for help, and they were also patient and kind when my ignorance or my whiteness showed its ugly head. I will always be grateful to them. And that is why and how my project of making the connections that John and I will talk about today began. Thank
you. Paula says we have 10 minutes, so if I have a grad student out there, the first question should be, will Professor Macy extend his remarks? So I can get in the rest of my, what's the point of having a grad student if they don't help you out, right? First, I should learn it works. I also want to give a plug to Arlene's book, Land Woman's Legacy. It was a dissertation. And the dissertation committee was Janetta Cole, Bailey Jackson, and myself. And after we convinced the School of Education that you could write an autobiography as a dissertation, I don't think it's been done since. It was a brilliant piece of work. It's one of the, as Arlene has in the book, that I kept waiting for the chapters, like what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. And it's a beautiful piece of work. If you want to read a wonderful account of that kind of transitional period, go read Arlene's autobiography. And Paula's claim to fame is that she taught my daughter Carly at Spelman. Carly didn't tell me that until midway through the course. She said, I'm taking this course on black women. I said, you got somebody down there teaches yes, Paula Giddings? I said, she'll do. We go back a long time. In any case, I'm coming at this from a different place than, Arlene, we're coming from different places, and we happen to meet here at UMass. My source of interest in the study of African American women came from about 3 sources. I'll keep them short. One is my family. Sitting around my dinner table, breakfast table, were the smartest women on the planet, my mother and my sister. They both went to college when they were 15 years old. They graduated when they were 19, and they did all kinds of stuff. So the idea that women didn't have brains was like, it wasn't happening, I had another cousin that went to college at 15, graduated with a degree in physics, couldn't get a job here in the 50s and went to Canada, she and her husband. So they've been teaching physics for the past 50 years in Canada. They retired now. On my father's side, Zora Neale Hurston lived in my grandmother's house in Sanford, Florida, when she wrote Jonas Gordon. I heard that over and over and over again. She and my mom ran together in the 30s because my mom's had a car, Zora never had a car. And so when Zora wanted to get around, she'd show up and want to ride, Miss Bethune stayed at our house when she came to Sanford, So I'm sitting there, eating, cornflakes for breakfast, and here comes Bethune's car rolling up, driven by her son Albert. So I grew up around, just in my household, there were these tremendous black women. This is a college president, for Christ's sake, come on. And then my mother taught at Howard University. You can't walk 2 feet on Howard's campus and not bump into black women who are geniuses. If you're talking about, Elsie Lewis, Lorraine Williams, Maris Tate, who people don't know about, who had brains she hadn't even found yet. You know, she got a PhD in Harvard in the 1940s in government. You know, Henry Kissinger stole all her stuff for his disarmament work. You know, go read her books on disarmament, then read Kissinger to see who got whose stuff, you know. And then Dorothy Porter, you know, you do your homework in the Moreland Spring Garden, and Dorothy Porter walks you through the stacks. I mean, you're like, I'm a little kid, you know, and nobody's in there but me, you know. So if I had a, you know, a little report to do with Toussaint Louverture, she'd take me back and pull out some photographs and stuff for me, you know, daguerreotypes in the 19th century. So the idea that women didn't have any brains is just, I mean, I could never get to that, you know, or that they were inferior in some kind of way. Then I went to Chicago in the 1960s and did movement work in Chicago. Well, anybody with half a brain knows that nothing in Chicago moves without Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Burroughs, and Christine Johnson, right? Nothing, right? You know, when we started our Negro History Club, the first person we invited was Gwendolyn Brooks. She's not a historian, she's a poet, but you can't do nothing in Chicago that Gwendolyn Brooks doesn't say is okay, right? And she came and said, I'm not a historian, I'll read poetry. Hey, we could have for that. But we could get off the ground and we were okay, right? Christine Johnson was the head of the University of Islam School, Nation of Islam. Most brilliant black woman I've ever met. Nobody knows about her, right? You know, got fired from the schools because she was a communist, but Elijah Muhammad picked her up and she put together an independent black school back in the 60s, you know, training these kids to go on and be scientists. Beautiful woman, very intelligent woman, but people look at that and say, oh, patriarchal organization, you miss Christine Johnson, you know. So you couldn't live in that world and think that men ran everything, and you certainly couldn't patronize any of these women. I always thought their eyes were watching God, because I always thought it was the greatest American novel. You know, people say Ralph Ellison, like, come on, give me a break. Their eyes are watching God. Then Ralph Ellison, right? I taught Nella Lawson's Only Thing in Print, Quicksand and Passing. Only thing in print, right? And you got Dorothy Sterling's collection and then Gerda Lerner, you know. When I was on the nominating committee for the OAH one year, we nominated Gerda Lerner for president. They have been inviting me back to the nominating committee since. I taught Ida B. Wells, Crusade for Justice. You know, I mean, it's part of the way you teach history. Half of the black population is women. How are you going to teach the history of black people? Don't teach about women. I mean, this is a numbers question, you know. And so I always could count. You get up to 50%, and you add another 50%, right? It's not a theoretical thing. It's common sense. The political rationale for all of this I learned from C.L.R. James, who we brought to Northwestern when I was a grad student. You know, he was one of our early demands. And James had this concept of self-activity and the idea of independent struggles of different types of people. And so what I learned was that you don't have to be somebody else in somebody else's movement, but if their movement is a movement for justice, then you support it. And they're right to have an autonomous movement. Right? I don't want to be in the women's movement, but I would support the women's movement, whatever their goals are, because anything that weakens the power of white male patriarchy is good. Right? However they do it is good. Right? You know, if you can break up that domination, it's good. So I don't have to figure out the complexities of feminism. All I have to know is that they have a feminist movement and more power to them. You know, and that was my take when Arlene showed up in my office. We didn't reach out to women's studies. Women's studies reached out to us. I'll never forget Arlene and Dale Melcher walked in and asked me would I come give a talk in her class in women's studies program. And I really wasn't so sure I wanted to do that. The idea of giving a talk about black people to a group of young white women was not exactly why I joined the academy. And I wasn't sure what I would say that wouldn't get me thrown out of there, or you know, somebody running to the dean and says this lunatic black man attacking white people or whatever. But Arlene said, say whatever you say to your regular classes. So I did. You know, it didn't put women first, put black people first. You know, that's what I do. So I'm a nationalist. Black women are first. Not white women, black women. I don't apologize for that. You know, don't budge off that. You know, so that was slightly upsetting to the white female audience because they thought they were first. Hey, I thought I wouldn't get invited back to that class, but Arlene said, oh, they needed that. Come back next year and do the same thing. You know, and so I could say, oh, this is somebody I can get along with. I took over the class from Esther and Janetta because we had the misfortune of having brilliant black women who kept going on and on and on and on and on. We both ended up as college presidents. What are we supposed to do? Hire dumb people so they stay around? You know. So we had black women who were geniuses and they went off to do great things. So I ended up teaching the course in black women in U.S. history for about 40 years. I enjoyed the Black Studies, Women's Studies seminars, but the picture that Laura painted is a lovely picture, but it was a bit more scrappy than that. We had to work our way toward getting along, right? It wasn't like we went in the room and everybody kind of hugged and said we all love each other. We had to think our way through, like, what is this all about? You know, and I was telling Paula, I'll never forget the first thing that we had to read was Adrienne Rich, Just Lawless Civilization. And she talked about her mammy. I'm saying, whoa, whoa, right? If this is white feminism, we're going to have a problem, right? I don't want to hear about nobody's mammy. I don't care who they are, right? Your mammy don't love you. Don't give me that. You know, you read that essay. She's talking about her mammy, right? So we had a big problem. Right, and we kind of fought that out, worked through that, and said, okay, you know, we bring some Audre Lorde up in here, you know. And so I got to meet all these people. I knew some of them before, you know, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Barbara Smith, Pat Bell Scott. I got 1 second left. And the consequence of that was that I found out, in fact, that my cousin Sharon was, in fact, in the Combahee River Collective. But she never told me. So I called up and kind of got mad about it. Like, why didn't you tell me that? She said, well, you never asked me. How would I know to ask you something like that? So I come to it with the kind of orientation toward the study of black women as central to the study of black people. And I also thought that women's studies by themselves on this campus wouldn't have the power to push to get the institutional mechanisms they needed to develop their movement as strong as they could. So I supported them. You know, I won't say my whole department did, because they didn't. You know, for a long time, I was like, well, you deal with that, you know, something about women or whatever. And so I was the one, if you look at those conferences, I was the only one on the planning committee, you know, for my department. You know, when we had African-American women in the vote, maybe 2 of the male faculty showed up. You know, when we co-sponsored Barbara Smith, I think Bernie Bell and I were the only ones to go hear her. You know, so it's not like all of a sudden everybody just kind of loved each other. We had to work our way towards an understanding of the role of black women, and we're still doing that. It's not over yet, you know. But I think demography is on the side of the women. If you look at the academy these days, there are like 10 times the number of black females coming in to the academy as black males, so that the women are going to reshape the thing whether men like it or not, you know. And the most interesting work being done in African American history now is the work being done on black women. The 2 major textbooks are authored by black women, Darlene Clark Hine, you know, Elizabeth Brooks Higginbottom. Right, the 2 leading best-selling textbooks in African American history are authored by black women. Right, the smartest people doing the smartest work, you know, except for David Lewis, put him in a box, are done by black women. You know, you read Telling History. It's like 13 stories of black women historians. These are brilliant people. You know, and there are more coming, you know. So I'm quite, you know, kind of optimistic about the way the field is going, but we still don't have the transformation of how we conceptualize the field that what I wanted at the beginning. Because I fundamentally believe, I really believe it fervently, that we're not going to comprehend the African American experience and the American experience unless we put women at the center of it, black women. Right? Because our major institutions, like people say the church is a major institution, who are the majority of the church? Who sets the tone inside the church? Black women. We don't study that in black history. We put that over there in women's studies or religious studies. And so we haven't reoriented the field, you know, and that's the work that must be done, you know, and that's the work that I think the field ought to do if it's going to survive as a field in the 21st century. So the first few years, like, sit down, I'm sitting down. Anyway, we had a good fight. We ended up here. We must have done something good because we got a room for people that want to talk about black studies and women's studies, which we didn't have 40 years ago. So we'll sit down, and one of my students will ask me to continue.
Thank you very much. I'll ask you to extend in a minute, John. Thank you very much for those presentations. I want to start off maybe with one question, and then I'd like you two to converse among yourselves for a while, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And of course, as we've all talked about and know, that sometimes the most painful tensions are among those who are supposed to be like-minded and political allies. And so when you think now of the resistance that both of you mentioned and the continuing resistance, I'd like to know your thoughts about what you think the source of it is, and if it's been if it's being mitigated in any way.
From my side, from the women's studies side, it's just whiteness. It's privilege. It's, the ability to set the agenda without thinking of other people, I mean, I think it's that simple. And what is it that will encourage people to take a different turn, to look differently? And, I talked about being Armenian and being the child of survivors of the genocide, victims of survivors, and that's what the Black movement made to me, and it didn't mean like it was over. And that's the other thing. You begin walking down a road that is really hard, and it's extremely lonely. I don't think it's as bad as now as it was then. I mean, there are other whites who now, but when I found Anne Braden, I thought my heart was going to break, because I couldn't even imagine somebody like Anne Braden. And I felt like she's been kept from me, So it was monumental meeting her. And I think for white people, we just have to get over ourselves. You have to get over thinking you're always right, and that's hard to get over. It's really hard to get over. So, and we live in a context, I mean, we talked a lot about context this morning, we live in a context where everything tells us we're right, and it's getting worse and worse again, So there's a lot to overcome, it takes a lot, and you need allies, and so, I found them in Afro-American studies. Yeah.
Joe, do you also want to talk a little bit about issues around gender and Black studies?
Yeah, I think some of the problem is that African American men took African American women speaking as an attack on them, rather than as part of a struggle to make the whole thing better. And what saved me was I was fortunate, because my mother and sister and daughter always kept me in check, right? And I never forget, I came home from some meeting, and I was like, must have said something stupid, because somebody had got on me about saying something stupid. And I asked my mom, I said, somebody accused me of being patriarchal. He says, do you think I'm patriarchal? She said, of course you are, but if you know about it, you should work on it. Right? I would never call myself a feminist, but you should be aware that you have male privilege, and then you work on it. Right? So when people bring it to your attention, they're not attacking you, they're bringing it to your attention. Right? Some of my best friends in the movement, poets, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, Paul, people like that, they are, Darlene, the Black women historians. How am I going to know, right, what the problem is if you don't listen to them when they tell you, right? And the arrogance we had, and I was never as shocked as during the Black Arts period when Black women began to speak, and they were saying stuff that we didn't think, we had never heard it before. We thought they would sound like us except they'd be women. And they got, yeah, that's what you did, yeah, really. You said, women on the platform, they'll just be just like us. And they started saying, whoa, wait a minute. Like when Sonia and I have these long discussions about that. I said, are y'all supposed to talk like that in public? Like, why you want to bring that up? She says, well, how else are we going to tell you? And then you deal with it. If you don't want to be accused of patriarchal behavior, whatever, then correct yourself, right? Don't attack the people that are bringing it to your attention. And that's hard, because that would acknowledge, and it's not dividing the race, and it's not, big arguments about Audre Lorde. Well, Audre Lorde's not black, she's a lesbian. What? No. There's 30 million black people, there's 30 million ways to be black. Right? It's very simple. Right? Every time I talk to her, she looked like a black person to me. You know, she grew up in Harlem, all that stuff. You know, came from the West Indies, black. She had different politics, right? Deal with that. You know, you talk to Barbara Smith. That first talk we went to when Bernie Bell and I walked in, we were the only men in the room. You know, because I had never heard of Barbara Smith, but we kicked in some money for it, and we said, well, go pay for it, might as well go here. And we walked in and looked around, and it was like, whoa, okay. And then she started talking, and you said, now I know why there's 90 men in this room. But at the end of her talk, right, I walked up to her and said, look, you know, this is African American Studies, we help pay for your talk and sponsor you. You're not alone. Don't ever feel you can't come to us for help. You know, don't think you have to take on white people, men or women, by yourself, right? You know, we are on your side. I said, I don't agree with everything you said because it was pretty harsh. You know, some of it didn't apply to me, some did. But we're on your side. You know, you're not alone. I don't think any, you know, deep down, you know, watching the way the black women in my family struggle and the things they put up with, there's no reason black women should feel beleaguered in this world when they take on a fight. And if that fight is a fight against black men, it's on us to take the weight of that fight, you know, and not push them away and say, why are you bringing it up, and so forth. You know, and that struggle to get to that point is a hard one because it means you have to back yourself down some. You know, you have to listen to things about yourself you might not want to hear. You know, but how else you going to know unless somebody tells you? You know, and that's the struggle. There's still a struggle within black studies. You know, there are not a lot of programs that are happy that have courses on black women. That's why there's an Association of Black Women Historians. You know, that they still feel the need to look after themselves. You know, or you get a book like Betty Collier's, you know, Jesus, Jobs, and Justice. In my mind, this is one of the best books written in the past 50 years. But, oh, that's black women's history. No, it's not. If you ever in it the whole way you look at African American people, if you read it and read it against the rest of our history, but if you read it as, oh, it's black women in the church, that's over there somewhere, then we will miss the contribution of that book. You know, and I think people are missing the contribution of that book. Or Paula's book on Ida B. Wells. It ain't just a biography of Ida B. Wells. It's a retelling of a whole historical period that pushes Du Bois and Booker T. Washington to the side and puts somebody else up in there, right? And we say, well, that talk about Du Bois and Booker T. Washington must not be important. No, it talks about Ida B. Wells. It's more important. You know, that's what we have to get our heads around. And it's difficult. It's not easy. You know, because black men are fighting for their space in the academy, and they say, well, I just got here. Why do I have to share? You know, well, you got here, open the door a little bit wider so that we're all up in here and we'll have more space we all can share. You know. Anyway, that's the long answer to a short question.
Well, I just want to say that I really put John to the test because the first thing I asked him to co-sponsor was Barbara Smith. And I knew what I was doing, but, you know, there wasn't a lot of hesitation.
Just a quick aside, I just went to an awards ceremony for Barbara Smith last week in New York. And of course she walked in with Shirlene de Blasio, First Lady of New York, both of whom have been in Combahee.
Right, both of them in Combahee, yeah.
Right.
Came out of Combahee.
So that was just marvelous, and there was a group called Black Women's Agenda. There was like 3,000 people in the audience. And so it was just a wonderful, you know, 2014 some things are happening.
Yeah, things.
I think, too, I just want to say a little bit about African American women and the vote.
Use the mic, please.
Yes, a rabble-rouser with a low voice. It's been my cross to bear. What John is talking about is reorienting the field, was what we were trying to do with African American women in the vote. And we got a grant to do planning sessions. We brought, I know we brought Bettina and Kitty Sklar, and no.
Yeah,
No, she was at the conference, but she wasn't at the planning session. The fight was at the conference. I think it was Betty Collier Thomas. Anyway.
No, Betty got into the fight with Kitty Slaw.
No, it was Elsa Barclay Brown. Anyway, it was a big fight. It was a huge fight. I remember because Elsa came and said, I am going to say something about Ellen Du Bois talking about black women historians having writing blocks. And I just want you to know this isn't against you. But anyway, we decided that we needed to have a planning conference for the conference because there hadn't been much work done in the field as a field, you know, and we wanted to okay, so if you look at the program for that, it's called African American Women in the Vote, 1837 to 1965, because it's not 1848. It's 1965 because the majority of African American women lived in the South and couldn't vote. So that was, and then the planning conference redid all of the periodizations of women's history, which was white women's history. So, you know, it was, and I have to say, there weren't a lot of women's studies people at this major conference. And the one women's historian that was here came for one session. One session. So, you know, it's been really hard.
And the thing that saved me, because I was trying to stay out of it, because there's all these very brilliant women fighting, and I'm sitting there like, what, you know, you have to be polite, right? And the only thing, because I thought there was a lot of racism there. I mean, I thought it was really bad, and I didn't want to, like, just walk out or something. So the person that saved me was Bettina Aptheker, you know, because I knew her father. I was really close to her father, Herbert. And I called up, you know, must have been like 10 o'clock at night at the campus center. She's staying over here. And I said, Bettina, now, straighten me out on this. I thought there was an awful lot of racism coming out of the white women in that meeting today. Was that just me being sensitive? Well, she said, no, I'm dealing with that over here now. You know, I said, thank God for the Aptheker family, right? You know, there are some white women, you know, who have a history of struggle against racism that you can rely on. You know, also in the battle we have Sue Thrasher. Sue is kind of quiet now, but Sue put her life on the line to join the civil rights movement. She didn't have to do that. You know, stepped out of her house, stepped into the movement, and could not go back. You know, she's in the back. We have these amazing kind of resources around here that we kind of slide over because they're not on TV all the time, that kind of thing. So there are people you can check with. You know, people that will tell you straight. Like if I say something that's sexist, I can answer, was that sexist? Say, yeah. Then I can say, I'm going to make you feel good and say it wasn't. I need to know. You know, and this was taking place at a fairly high kind of intellectual level because we're trying to reshape a field by ourselves. You know, there isn't anything else out there. I mean, there literally was nothing else out there. You know, I was joking, if they had dropped a bomb on this building that day, you would have wiped out black women's history for a generation, right? Because there were like 30 of the leading black women historians. The only one here was Darlene, because Darlene had an appointment, I think she was in Ireland at that time, she couldn't make it. But everybody else was here, from Dorothy Sterling on down. You know, Anne Bray, was Anne here? And, no, Sterling, that's the 60s speech in the 80s. But it was, you know, the whole group of them, you know, Ellen Du Bois, you had Betty Collier Thomas, Tony Travis, Cynthia Nevedon Morton, Ena Farley. I mean, it was a whole range of leading black women historians, you know, Elsa Barclay Brown. And, you know, somebody hit the building, that would have...
But, you know, nobody from the history department came to that conference.
Nobody.
Not one person except this one women's historian came to one session with a friend, I think. She might have been from history. So,
Joyce,
you know, it was
on the
Joyce, oh, excuse me,
Yeah,
Joyce
Joyce
Bergman. Yeah, Joyce Bergman. But, you know, so this wonderful thing is happening, and as a women's studies person, I'm sitting there fuming.
You know, I'm mad because my faculty won't show up, and she's mad because our faculty won't show up. You know, and they say, well, you went, that's enough. It's like, no, that's not enough. That's not enough. You know, it's not enough. And let me tell you, we shouldn't leave Joyce out. Joyce and I taught the first graduate course on black women's history probably in the country. And we heard a hall, history department, we didn't have a graduate program yet. We had 30 students, right? I walk in there, heard a hall, this little seminar rooms, people all out in the hallway. I thought there was somebody, we had the wrong classroom. And I said, like, who are all these people? I think we have a seminar in here. And they said, yeah, this is Black women's history. I said, yes, this is what we want. 30 people. At the end of the semester, the history department head came to Joyce and said, you shouldn't teach this again because it's taking people away from the more important seminars. The more important seminars. I did not deal with, I said, Joyce, I ain't dealing with that. We're going to teach it on the Afro-Am number from now on. We don't have to worry about that no more. That's what we had to fight to get through. They treated Joyce like crap in the history department. They didn't welcome her. They didn't even think it was a topic. They were quite glad to have it taught in Afro-Am because they thought, like, how are you going to teach a course on Black women's history if there's nothing to teach? That was the attitude. That's what we were up against. Labor Center the same way. Had a student came into the Labor Center. Black woman out of Chicago, there was a union organizer, wanted to write on the history of Black women in labor. They told her no such topic. She came and took my seminar on Black women in labor. Right? And she said, what can I do? I said, why don't you do an annotated bibliography and leave one behind, when you leave it, so maybe they'll know next time. And she got up to 50 pages. I told her to stop it. That's enough. That should do it. Right? How can somebody sit there in a labor center, right, and not know the history of the struggle of Black women? How you going to look at slavery and not know the history of Black women's labor? Like, come on. But that's what we're up against. It's changed now, so everybody's now kind of multicultural and, touchy-feely and stuff. But it was a fight to get people to get that information and that outlook and that point of view into the academy. The academy didn't just open up the doors and say, come on in. The space you occupy now is space we had to kind of dynamite people out of to get you in there. And you should be aware of that. And if you don't keep your eyes open, people will slide you back out again if you don't keep your eyes open. Because you don't win a game and hold it forever. You have to keep fighting to hold it. You may have to fight again and again to maintain what you have. And that's what our lives were. Yeah.
So just on the labor issue, the labor historian in the history department was asked if he couldn't teach. He's a progressive guy. Same thing. There's no material, which wasn't true either.
Oh, yeah, your questions are whatever. Yeah, sure.
Questions, comments?
I have a question. Thank you so much. My question is, so I have had 2 academic jobs, and both of them, one was in a gender and race studies department at the University of Alabama. Now I'm a joint appointee in women's studies and Africana studies at Rutgers. And so as I listen to you guys, you're narrating these histories of struggle. And I think, to sort of shore up these fields institutionally. And now it feels like we're relitigating the same struggle. Like, the struggle never stops. Like, every time I go to a faculty meeting, I just feel this there's always this push to, like, justify your existence, right? And I'm wondering, on this end, with the sort of long history that you have, the sort of long vantage point, how should we be thinking about these histories of institutional struggle now? Because it seems like, the narrative of humanities is being pushed out, STEM is sort of right, so I've watched one department really get gutted where, at Alabama where I taught first, and so I no longer teach there, so I feel more at liberty to say, we had like a department, they hired all these Black faculty and then wouldn't treat them well. So literally, you just had everybody leave in a year's time, right? And now there are students who need a home. There's no institutional support. And so that's the way that folks sort of give institutional, they say that we support this, but then one way or another, they don't take care of the students or they don't take care of the faculty, and then those programs have no institutional stability. And so then, I'm sitting here going, I read all of this intellectual history. I know these histories of struggle. I'm also trying to get tenure. Right? So how do you both fight, be a part of that struggle, fight, because these are such important intellectual homes for all of us who do this work, when it seems like the institutional beast is so much bigger, right? And so much more savvy in some ways than it was even 40 years ago, right? I just wonder if you have thoughts on that or advice or even just some perspective.
You know, a good place to start is you know, Deborah Gray White's Telling Histories,
Yeah.
right? You know, Deborah White's been a friend of mine an awful long time, right? And if you ever know her, she doesn't give the slightest hint of not being in fully control of the whole world, right? And when I read the story about, she had doubts about her book, I said, great book, that's impossible. She said, until she walked into that session, her colleagues told her that her book, On Our Woman, it's not really history. This is not really about anything. I said, man, what kind of fools are you working with that would say something like that? But if you can put doubt in her mind, right, that means people a lot, you know, weaker than her, you know, are going to have to fight a lot stronger. But the fact is, you can't let the institution beat you, right? You're not going to be comfortable. You know, it's that biblical saying, you know, woe be unto them that are at, you know, at ease in Zion. Well, you know, in Babylon. This is still Babylon. It ain't gotten much better. And you're not supposed to be comfortable, so don't think you're going to get comfortable. If you can get comfortable by, you know, in the old days we called them lap dogs and running dogs and like that. So if somebody gave us $15 million, we might quiet down and be comfortable, but ain't nobody giving us a penny. So that means we have to fight for everything. But we're not going to do what it takes to get $15 million, right? Because that's not what we're about, right? So that means if you come into this field and love the field as a field and not worried about too much about, you know, keeping a job and so forth, you have to risk. And you have to be prepared, and you find allies, right? And you don't walk away when somebody says no, because administrators always say no. That's what their job is. Can I have this? No. You say, thank you very much. I assume that's your opening response. My thing is like, they'll give you a list of priorities. Well, you're not on, you know, you're way down there. I said, got to get to sometime. Why not get me out of the way by doing me first? Right? You got, you know, if you're going to get to me, because you said I'm on the list, just, you know, I'm going to come back tomorrow if you do me first. Right? You know, don't let people game you with bureaucratic language. Right? This is a political institution. The academy is political. These places were not designed for us. Their goal is not our well-being. Right? And don't fool yourself into thinking that they are. You are here trying to make it into something that will serve your interests. It doesn't serve your interests yet. It can if you work on it. But that's a long-term struggle. You're not going to win that tomorrow morning, and don't quit after a day, right? But you gain enough. Like, you know, Black Studies was a fallback from a larger movement we were in. So you hold on to that, right? 40 years later, you know, 20 years later, we realized we weren't reproducing ourselves, so we started a graduate program. Because we looked around and we didn't see ourselves. You know, like, how are we going to go on? And you look around and say, whoa, this is not working. So we better train our own people. So then we started a graduate program just so we could train people that knew what we knew. Because the people we were hiring, you know, we were out there in the field, weren't trained by the black people like we were trained. So we're going to have to train our own people, right? And so that's what our goal was, you know. And those people are trained collectively, so when they go out and get a foothold, they will hire the other people. So our grads hire our other grads, right? They're not Jackie Robinson. No, they're going to bring everybody. You know, so, you know, if you got a department head somewhere, the first people you look at is people like, hey, get the other UMass people up in there. Now, there'll be 3 or 4 y'all can move this thing. You have to think politically, even though you have to do your work. You know, you do your work. You use your brain. You know, you don't shortstop on your brain. You don't slide on stuff. You don't let your students slide, right? But you got to understand you're in a political environment, right? And people smiling at you may not be your friend, you know. And if people like you, they will give you things. That's how you tell. If the dean says, oh, I like you, can we have some more money? No, then you don't like me. You know, that's how you can tell an institution like this. If they give you stuff, they like you, or at least putting up with you. If they don't give you stuff and say they like you, then they're lying to you. You know, and just be aware of that. You know.
I just want to acknowledge that things are a lot worse now than they were. You know, there's less money. As you say, the humanities are under attack. Finding jobs is really hard. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I agree completely with John about the place being political. And you have to find allies, but you have to figure out how to tell the allies from the enemies. Because they look alike sometimes, you know. And I think the thing about whether they're giving you stuff is really important. Are they coming to you, to your defense? If you know, are they putting themselves out to support you? Then they're an ally. If they only support you when it's convenient, forget it. Find somebody else. You know. And women's studies networked like crazy. We were everywhere. One of the chancellors said, "They're everywhere," you know. But I think the political situation is different now. It really is. So, in some sense, you have to find your own way.
And also don't split. The other thing we did was we never allowed the administration to split us, right? We've had deans who would tell people in women's studies, you could have more positions except Afro-American studies got all of them. We get a phone call 2 seconds after that meeting. This is what the dean said, right? So, okay, we got it. Call them, say, Dean, like, how you doing? Like, why are you telling people in women's studies that, you know, we're in competition with them? We're not in competition with them. They need more positions. Don't say we have them. Take them from history or somewhere else. Take them from us. No, don't let them do that. You know, we lost June Jordan because we had a dean that lied to both of us and said that we didn't want her, and then they told us that women's studies didn't want her, and we both wanted her. You know.
No. Women's studies did not want June Jordan. Let us set the record straight here.
They didn't want it.
Women's studies would not support the June Jordan appointment.
Why not?
You'll have to ask them. No, June Jordan was, we talk about intersectionality. June Jordan was there from the beginning. She was there from the beginning. This is not something that white women want to hear. Report from the Bahamas is one of the most incredible, poetic expressions of intersectionality. And when it came out in Ms. Magazine. Do you know where it was? In the travel section. It was in the travel section. And do you know what the cover of that issue was? Is Santa Cruz a feminist paradise? So, you know, a women's studies program that is basically have a white orientation does not want someone like June Jordan.
Food for thought. May I ask Dr. Collins to wrap up a few minutes, and then I just want to make an announcement about lunch, but this is great. Big round of
That's still ringing in my, in my brain. Thank you so much. This kind of, this history is so important, and we don't express it enough. We don't talk about this kind of institutional history enough, and I think we've been really fortunate to have such tremendous panelists in Arlene and John who have this institutional history and are willing to be honest and frank and to edify us all. So thank you very much.
Just a quick announcement about lunch. We had asked people to register and indicate if they would be here for lunch and ask them about their dietary needs. But we have more lunch here